Well, what's been going on in the world over the past several days and weeks, perhaps longer, really is quite astounding. It really is. It seems as though the U.S. and allies, what some people might call the American empire, has decided to all at once take several initiatives to reverse what seem to have been losses, almost in like an Empire Strikes Back way. And they decided to do it in a way where they don't have to invade a country or use tanks or missiles or bombs directly, at least. So what we have is in Venezuela and Ukraine, we have the same, basically, policy, the same type of initiative applied roughly the same way, with differences, of course, because of the country. And it's designed to overthrow those two governments. And in Ukraine, it looks like it may have, at least temporarily, to some degree, succeeded. We don't really know what's going to happen in Ukraine, and I'll get to that in a moment. In Venezuela, it could succeed, but it'll probably take a lot longer, and that's a somewhat of a different situation than the Ukraine. And we have the prior history of what happened in Venezuela, and the people are aware. The masses of people, the poor people, are aware of what the U.S. is capable of and what the U.S. has done. Meanwhile, a third part of the equation is what is happening in Syria, which a long time ago transformed into sort of a different initiative where the opposition became an armed opposition. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, maybe I should say allegedly or arguably being supported by the West. But I think most people agree that that would be the case, that the opposition in Syria, which isn't united in itself, by the way, is being supported by the West, and they're fighting an armed insurrection against the government of Syria. It's always funny to me when I turn on the American media, and some of these media outlets still call them activists. And so what kind of activists run around with heavy artillery and weapons? It's just outrageous, and it's ridiculous. But meanwhile, in Syria, in Venezuela and Ukraine, I should say, we have a different sort of strategy. The idea is to take, the people that are unhappy, which was the original idea in Syria and in Libya before the NATO bombing started, I must say. But to take the people that are unhappy, even though they might not be the majority, and they could even be few in number, really. Certainly in Venezuela, the poor massively outnumber the rich, who are really the ones who are leading this protest that's really, they have been allied with the U.S. empire, and they want their status and their position back, in Venezuela. But in Ukraine, it seems somewhat worse what the U.S. has done. They've taken what seems to be the worst elements, what many have claimed to be, have alleged to be, the far right, and many commentators have even said fascists, parties, and sort of supported them in their effort to overthrow what was a democratically elected government. Whether the people really liked that government or not is another story, but it was democratically elected, which they're calling a revolution, but in reality can only be called a coup. Another thing that I thought quite strange, in fact, as an aside, was that video, that viral video. They're always viral when they're propaganda for the state, it seems like, with the young, sort of attractive Ukrainian girl trying to pull on everyone's heartstrings and get everyone involved, but she doesn't really tell you anything, and she doesn't really say what it's really about, and she doesn't explain really what's happening in Ukraine, even by the news reports that even make it to the West, and certainly not by the news reports that some Westerners are seeing or paying attention to, out of the foreign media, particularly the Russian media. So now we have this situation where the U.S. has supported what many claim are the worst elements. And historically, there's a line, some say. We know that the Ukraine, many of the people in the Ukraine during World War II, the grandfathers perhaps of many of the same people who are connected to the far right in Ukraine now, were sort of supporters of the Germans fighting the Russians in World War II. And now we have this situation where these people are going to be, in some fashion, part of the Ukrainian government. Right on the border of Russia, keep in mind, which doesn't seem very tolerable, or it seems like it wouldn't be very tolerable to the Russians. At the same time, you have, in the east of Ukraine, you have people who are very pro-Russian, who speak Russian, who really are quite unhappy about this situation. Some of them there have been rumblings that there might be, they might secede from Ukraine and either be independent or even join the Russian Federation. We have rumblings out of Russia in a few different sources that, first of all, they claim that they'd like to not interfere, but at the same time, there have been some who've implied that if there was a threat to the Russian-speaking people in the east, especially Crimea, where the Russian Black Fleet is based, then they would have to respond. So none of this bodes well, and you've got to kind of wonder why the U.S. and the EU do these things, because in the short term it looks like a great coup, to not in the way of a pun, for the U.S. foreign policy, but in the long term it's a disaster, kind of like every other. It looks like a disaster. Maybe there's some other plot that I cannot see, that I'm not able to see higher up, that maybe the idea is to make disasters all over the world, like in Libya, like in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, but that's too obvious to even go into. But let's say that they're not trying to make a disaster. Maybe they are, but let's say that they're not. That's what the future, that's what looms out on the horizon, is either a disaster or really the Russian section of the Ukraine, in their zeal to defend themselves from their point of view against the West, and to not be subject to this, that they might leave the Ukraine and implore, not just ask, but beg Russia to sort of interfere, as the West says, and then you could see that would become again protectorate in some way of the Russian Federation, Crimea, maybe other parts of the East Ukraine, and if that and Russia has a lot of clout economically, but that's a whole nother story anyway. The EU thinks they have clout economically, but if you look at Greece and Italy and places like that, I don't know how anyone could think that leads to anything good. Most especially the Ukrainians. I can't understand their interest in joining the EU, actually, but I'm far away, so you could say, what do I know? But We all know the story of Greece. We all know the story of Italy in the EU, within the EU. And we know the story of the IMF, which is what the EU intends to impose upon Ukraine. What I'm saying is, over the next few days, weeks, maybe months, maybe longer, this could really backfire on U.S. policymakers, and you got to wonder why they would even do it, because Russia could end up, with basically the eastern, at least the southeastern and Crimea part of Ukraine as a protectorate. Ukraine loses part of its territory, the part of its territory where a lot of the industry is, I'm told. And I don't see how that's a win for U.S. policymakers. They might think it is. I don't know. I guess expanding NATO at any cost is what they do, and to encircle Russia and to be right on its doorstep. The events in Venezuela, if I haven't mentioned it earlier, perhaps I have, I think will take longer to play out. I could be wrong, but we'll see what happens. And of course, the events in Syria are ongoing, and really events in Libya, although it's been swept under the rug and practically forgotten, are ongoing. And I'm told that Libyans in general, many of them, have found themselves in a desperate situation. There was a video with an interview by a Libyan expatriate that talked about these things and how what was happening in Libya didn't seem pleasant. And there's great hardship. And I don't know why my government insists on causing great hardship all over the world, including here. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the American people are very unhappy. I think they just don't know what to do about anything, though. They're just trying to get by. They've been kept sort of, you could say, ignorant by their media and including television in Hollywood and such. So they don't have enough information to know what to do, but they don't know what to do anyway, and there's no... The organizational left hasn't really, proved to come through either. And regardless of what the U.S. leaders might want you to believe, they're not, they point at Ukraine and say, do not repress your protesters, don't do that. Well, there have been, we saw what they did to Occupy Wall Street. We saw what they did to that economic forum when the protesters came to Pittsburgh for that. That was several years ago, for that economic forum. So the hypocrisy is quite blatant.